So we do it away. We can use the ceiling microphones. And I think I've shown you this before, Sam, actually. Yeah, that's the microphones. But yeah, so if it's set to ceiling, it'll be the whole room. But if we're in a presentation, usually what I'll say is go ahead and get that wireless mics. And then
check 1, 2. You'll hear me in the speakers, and then the people on Zoom will hear you, and only you, and not the whole room. Mic's on, and then when you want to hear presentation, you can go wireless.
Actually, I can have some flip on now. You want to have my flip back? That's awesome. Can we hear no time? Yeah. Oh, can I? When you're in Zoom, so in Zoom, it'll have a whole screen. I wrote this little menu where you can each individual screen. So I'll put the picture in front and just set it in the laptop here, so that everyone can see the bigger. But what kind of nice with that little picture we do in the corner? What I'll do for a lot of events is have it start like this, and then when you begin the presentation, so that's what we're sending for sound room. This was what we're sending to for video. So as long as that picture is on, it'll show the two things. So when you start, you come and get laptop, and you would make a presentation big, and you put the camera small. Yeah. Yeah. Because that's what I've been doing for a lot of us lately. We'll kind of get the presentation big, zoom on the screen, so when it starts, we'll flip off the presentation big and camera small. Yeah.
We're going to get a laptop to watch for people who need to be asked to leave, so probably having that means a closed. Oh, good. Yeah, good. Okay.
You don't need anything, I can run back around, but I think there's 8 will handle Sam here. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Hi, Mary, how are you? Perfect. You might be able to in the meeting, shut off the video for the. Yeah, right.
Intent, what it is, the history. I'd rather ask this question about this uproar at this time in this place. And the way I chose to frame it was, why they be tripping about critical race theory? And there's a very particular way that I'm going to explain why I ask it that way, right? Ebonics, in other words, some of you are familiar. There's a very particular way and a reason why I chose that particular phraseology, why they be tripping. So let's get into it. This is just a grounding reflection. Something I want everybody in the room to consider. People on Zoom, thank you for joining us on Zoom, to consider and reflect the meaning of this for yourself. I'll read it, but just as a way of getting us grounded into the space and time today. It is a consistent practice among progressives to bemoan the genocide of Native peoples, but in the interest of political expediency, implicitly sanction it by refusing to question the legitimacy of the settler nation responsible for this genocide. This comes from Andrea Smith, the way of a Dakota critical scholar and thinker, Waziatowin, who I'm going to also mention later. So I start with this one because generally I've been seeing a lot of land acknowledgements when people start presentations. And while I think that in some ways is appropriate to at least give memory to that, for me though, as a critical scholar and thinker, this speaks more because it's not just about acknowledging, it's about thinking about ways to repair what's been done. Just food for thought. The next quote to ground us, again, intentionally chosen just because of this topic that we're going to get into today, is from W.E.B. Du Bois. And again, I'll read it just for reflection. Think about how you feel as you're hearing these words, as you're reading these words. Think about what's coming up for you intellectually as you're thinking about your belief systems, as you and taking these words. It's very important to ground ourselves in a holistic way into this topic and this discussion. So Du Bois said, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American. Now, of course, the language is dated. He's not using Black American or Black. He's not using sort of a gender neutral, because this is something he said in 1903. But my point is that still take this in, because we're going to come back in certain ways to understand his words, even in the context of today. All right, so while I'm hesitant to give a whole explanation of critical race theory, I do think it's important to give people some idea of some of the foundations for this framework and for the theory. So I'll touch upon some things really briefly. To start with, I will say this: critical race theory is not new. And in fact, I would say, going back to Du Bois, it's also not new to discuss race in a critical fashion. Du Bois's question actually is doing that, even though he didn't call it critical race theory. He's saying, is it possible for a Black man to be both Black and an American? That's what he's asking. He didn't call it critical race theory. So it's not a new, and the reason I say racial formation is because that's not new either. And so we'll come back to understanding and unpacking these, but that's a brief thing. So it's not a new theory, but in terms of the formal structure of so-called critical race theory, I showed a picture first, and then I'll give you the name. But so this is Derek Bell, and Derek Bell is considered one of the founders of what we now know as the theoretical framework known as critical race theory. He's one of the founders, and he was really critical. And in fact, one of the first pieces was his critique of Brown versus the Board of Education in '54, which he wrote for the Harvard Law Review in 1980, really looking at the fact that, was that law actually going to lead to the outcomes that people suggested that it would? Was the law alone enough? So critical race theory began in legal studies, is what I'm saying. It began with legal scholars and legal activists in some ways. This picture here is Kimberly Crenshaw, who came along a little bit later, but has really, 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 really important work in critical race discourse. And her seminal work, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was actually both at UCLA School of Law as well as Columbia Law School, her work is around this concept known as intersectionality. So that it's rejecting the single axis of identity, meaning it's not, so this race piece plays probably the most seminal role, but when you start constructing identities like gender, and class, and sex, and gender expression with race, and especially with skin color, then she saw patterns and which exists around how discrimination gets compounded and stacked on top of discrimination, stacked on top of other forms of discrimination. So her work is similar. So these are some of the founding principles in the theory. So I'm going to just, again, rather than getting too much in the weeds and defining what it is or isn't, I want to start with some of what the national discourse has been and the claims made. So I'm just going to show you the claims, and then I'm going to unpack these later, but I just want to just have us sit with these as we're unfolding this presentation. So the first claim, and again, these are not exclusive, there are more claims than this, but these are some of the more prevalent ones that I've seen in news and in reports and in reporting that's currently taking place. So the first claim is it's divisive, separating people out by race, and it's causing division. That's the claim for people. Next claim, it is indoctrinating people into a Marxist worldview. In other words, it's socialist. And the goal is to overturn this American enterprise and the capitalist system that this country was founded upon into a socialist nation and socialist structure. So that's the claim. Third claim, this is important for anyone in education, particularly K-12 education and other tangential professions to education, even higher education. It says it teaches Black children that they are inferior. Because if you call out the ways that race plays into people's outcomes, and particularly for Black folk and for Black children, somehow teaching them about race and racism causes them to think of themselves as inferior. So that's not good either. So that's the claim. Fourth claim, it makes white children feel blamed for racism in the past. Because if one is saying that slavery was a bad thing and like white people owned Black people, then in today's world, white children can feel bad about themselves for what happened in the past. So that's the claim. So that's one of the prevalent themes I've seen in discussion. And then the last one, it is un-American or against American values. And that goes back to tie with point number 2, because of the Marxist socialist connection, or alleged Marxist socialist connection, and it's against American values. And we'll talk more about what American values are later. So that's just the claims, just to get us going into looking at the examples of these claims. So you can, this is easily Googleable. That's a word I make up, Googleable. So the current headlines, a couple of current headlines, just again, this is an actual headline. School board meetings across the country beset with anti-CRT protests. People going to school board meetings, demanding to know what the curriculum is, demanding and suggesting that CRT better not be something that is taught in the schools. And back to those claims made earlier, always making sure that they mention those claims when demanding that it not be taught. So, because it's too divisive, it's Marxism, it's socialism, it's un-American, all those claims, right? So this was an actual headline. Another headline I read, and I'm gonna spend a little time on this one because this one's really interesting to me. Tennessee, House Bill 580 bans CRT in K-12 education. So they passed a law that said CRT can't be taught. And if one is alleged to be taught, there will be an investigation. And if it is found that a teacher or principal or educator is teaching it, not only will they be fired, but the school will be financially sanctioned to withhold funds. I have House Bill 580 in Tennessee right here. Here's one of the claims that I mentioned earlier. It's actually written to this bill, but it's because, remember, CRT began in legal studies. This is legal. An individual should, so first of all, it says, the public or charter school shall not include or promote the following concepts as part of a course of instruction or in a curriculum or instructional program, or allow teachers or other employees in the public schools or charter school system to supplement instructional materials that include or promote the following concepts. I won't read all of them, but I'll read this one. An individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or another form of psychological stress solely because of the individual's race or sex. Another one, promoting or advocating the violent overthrow of the United States government. We're going to come back to that one for sure. Ascribing character traits, values, moral or ethical codes, privileges, or beliefs to a race or sex, or to an individual because of the individual's race or sex. In other words, that's talking about you can't say that somebody has privilege because of these characteristics. That's Tennessee House Bill 580. Texas passed a similar bill. Florida is passing that bill. So, another headline then, attached to these two big headlines is this one. Washington Post reported Texas parents accuse a Black principal of promoting critical race theory. The district has now suspended him. He no longer has that job. And it was alleged that he's teaching critical race theory. No due process, it's just alleged. He doesn't have a job. The Atlantic, this is in Tennessee. but this is the headline, but I'll give you the context. He taught the Ta-Nehisi Coates essay, then he was fired. That happened in Tennessee. House Bill 580 supported that. Go on. I have critical questions. So why they be tripping? And I said to you before that I was going to frame this in the context of Ebonics, because I think Ebonics is instructive to in a really concise way to grapple with this. Because in Ebonics, which is actually drawn from ancient African sort of philosophy and beliefs, that time is not linear. So our past and our present and our future is actually commingling. And the phenomenon that we talk about with this particular topic, because this concept about race formations around race is not new. These are themes that keep reoccurring in different iterations. So Ebonics, just real quickly, in saying it this way, it makes the be habitual. That's what they call it. Like that means it's not just like it's not. I don't have to reference a tense when I do it this way, because what it's actually saying is they were tripping yesterday, they were tripping 200 years ago, they tripping today, and they'll probably be tripping in the future. And the way tripping, by the way, is in my in my upbringing, it was a way to describe when people are acting in ways that are sometimes irrational. Sometimes people are acting in ways that are unusual. Sometimes people that are unsettled in their bodies, and so they might react in ways that are startling or alarming. Right? So we say, that person's tripping. So I'm asking, why they be tripping? What's at stake? That's my other question. Because for this level of discourse, this level of scrutiny and attention being drawn to this thing, which is not new, I always ask, well, what's behind that? What's at stake? Why are so many people showing up to school boards? Why are people getting fired for allegedly teaching something, by the way, that's not taught in K-12? I just want to make that, because it's not a K-12 discipline. So here we go. Let's get into it. This is memory. Yeah, this person's no longer president, but there's still historical memory that we need to understand. A few weeks ago, I banned efforts to indoctrinate, there's that word, government employees with divisive, there's another thing, and harmful sex and race-based ideologies. Today, I've expanded to that ban to people and companies that do business. With our country, the United States military, government, contractors, and grantees, Americans should be taught to take pride in their great country. If you don't, there's nothing in it for you, because it's un-American to teach critical race theory. So, only bring that up to contextualize some both historical and present day ways to think about this. So now, and by the way, so now I'm actually using critical race theory to describe this. So Derek Bell has what he called the rules of racial standing. And one of them is that cyclical progression is always followed by cyclical regression. So what does that mean? What he's saying is that progress, oftentimes progress for indigenous, Black, brown, Asian, Pacific Islander people, oftentimes when there's any notion of systemic or structural ways that progress is made, there's a regression, but the regression doesn't happen by itself. The regression has active participants that help to cause it. That's what Wazi Yatewin was talking about in that opening quote, questioning the legitimacy of things, of the nations that cause these outcomes. So we've been here before, is how I describe it. That's Ebonics. We've been here before. So let me give you an example of cyclical progression, cyclical regression. So there was a civil war. By all practical purposes, contrary to what people in varying parts of the country have been taught as the reasons for the war, most scholars agree at some level that it was because of this idea around economies and the fact that slavery was becoming to be something that was intolerable for so many people, and they had a whole war over it. But then after the war, and I'm saying this intentionally, so white folk and Abraham Lincoln's administration paid reparations to white former slaveholders rather than former enslaved black folk in order to unify the country. So they had a progression, and instead of empowering those who had just worked for 244 years for free, and I don't call them plantations, I call them death camps, because that's what they were, because they could work you to death and literally just bring in another person, another human being, another body. And then they paid who? They didn't pay the formerly enslaved, they paid the slaveholders. Another example. Then we had Reconstruction, which is on the heels of that, where probably one of the greatest moments and movements of economic development and growth and progress was in the 12 years following this whole war. And people were getting elected. Now, of course, they didn't elect women, but they did elect black men in several southern states to Congress and so forth. A governorship. I mean, it was popping, like they were like moving. And then this is where Waziata in my mind again, because political expediency. They made a deal in 1977 between what used to be the Dixiecrats and then the Republicans to usher in what is now called Jim Crow. And here's what they did. So it was a contentious election. The Republicans, said, what, let's work this out, because they weren't going to agree. We just came off of a civil war. It's been 12 years. And so the Dixiecrats said, okay, we'll tell you what. We'll put our votes, electoral votes, to your candidate. Rutherford B. Hayes was that candidate. The Southern presidential candidate was, or the Dixiecrat candidate was Samuel Tilden. And they said, so we'll give it to Hayes if you will take the troops out of the South. If you take the troops out of the South, you got a deal. Why was that important? Because the troops were enforcing the new rules after the war. And then as soon as the troops left, you start seeing new laws come in. This is where, again, critical race theory, legal scholarship, new laws like jaywalking was against the law. Vagrancy. Vagrancy was if you were caught in public and didn't have a job, you're a black man in public and didn't have a job, you went to jail. Jim Crow. We've been here before. So then we had some of the early points of the migration. People started making economic developments on their own, building communities, getting educated, going to schools, like people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others. And so what you had is several examples of this phenomenon. So it says white folk terrorized black bodies when there was any inkling of economic advancement in black communities by burning down their neighborhoods, looting, lynching, burning alive, and eliminating any form of economic advancement, such as in Tulsa. This is well known. I mean, that's been in the news, and in fact, they made a movie, a new documentary on Tulsa, and in Rosewood, Florida, and other cities. These are just two of the more prominent ones. Rather than see any economic development have staying power, they were just burned down. And then skip forward. We had other advancements. Some people call this period during that civil rights era, especially culminating in 64, 65, the second Reconstruction. There's some scholars who say that was like the second Reconstruction. Because after the Voting Rights Act, they also had the Fair Housing Act. I mean, there were some things that were happening. But then this thing that happened that I find really, really intriguing is what they call the Southern Strategy. Southern Strategy was employed, eventually leading to a major provision that allowed new iterations of voter suppression to keep black and brown people away from the ballot box. Because they took one major provision away just a few years ago, and that's why you see all of these different laws now in certain states that are going right back to these coded ways of keeping people from the ballot box. And so, again, Google that. I'm not going to explain all of that, but that's something that you can Google and start to investigate for yourselves. But my point is that the Southern Strategy, this is what it was. Lyndon Johnson actually summed it up good. He said, all you have to do is convince the poorest, lowest white man that he's better than the black man. And not only will he give you any money that he does have, he'll pull his pockets out and give you the lint in his pocket. So race can be used as a weapon, in other words, and even in a coded way, for political gain. That was the Southern strategy. And I'll give you a name if you want to look it up to even go into this further, because it's actually on tape. Lee Atwater, just look it up, right? So, who was a Republican strategist at that time. And I'm saying Republican, Democrat, now mind you, because the people that think, oh, this is getting too partisan. Let me just give you, let's just stop and pause. When it comes to race, and Derek Bell that basically would say this in his Rules of Racial Standing, is that actually the theory is to critique liberalism more than anything, because it's saying that usually in a neoliberal environment, people assume that if we just have these laws that would be constructed so that there can be equal opportunity, then things would be better and we could have equality. That's a neoliberal worldview. Bell is saying that's not true, not when it comes to race. So it's not about Democrat, Republican, Independent, it's about race. And if our laws are actually designed in order to create these quote unquote equal outcomes or not. It's just questioning that. So just want to make that point. So here we are, just bringing it up to today. This is where we are currently. We are amidst a racial reckoning, as a lot of scholars are calling it, and or the third Reconstruction, possibly, sparked by the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Arbery's trial, that murder trial is actually underway now. We're going to follow that closely and see what happens. And then on top of it, a global pandemic. That's where we are. We have to contextualize all of this then in these lived experiences for so many people, particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, and so forth. Notice I'm not saying BIPOC and all that. I just want to give you a quick thing of my choice. I'm not saying that people, there's a lot of different scholars that use different language. I don't do that because I think white is a color too, so I don't say people of color. White is a color too. In fact, the invention of white, if you read Neil Painter's book, The Invention of White People, you'll understand why it's important to just name the race. White is a color too. So these are the lived experiences. And so going back then to unpack more of this question, why they be tripping? I think about both implicit and explicit reasons. I don't assume that every white person goes out with intent, malice to do harm to all the other groups who are not white. I don't assume that. Implicit association is a real phenomenon, again, that in fact, it not only affects white people. Like if you look at some of the implicit association tests, I think Harvard has one that's pretty accessible online. Even Black folks have an implicit association that triggers them to prefer white people when it comes down to it. So when I say implicit, it really is that. But then there are some explicit things too. You have to be real about that, be honest about that. So some of them have to do with this. Again, this can be both of those things. It can be, people not really realizing implicit settler colonialist ideas, or it could be people wanting to further settler colonialism explicitly. Could be both. It could be all of those. So Waziata, when in her book, The Struggle for Freedom, Dakota Homeland, talks about land and reparations for the land and resources. And she talks about the colonizer mindset and how devastating it has been, to the indigenous peoples of Minnesota, particularly. Another book that I find really, really important actually was, again, because I use sources that are both now current, and I use sources that are not necessarily what we call current, but actually are still relevant, because again, if I'm using my Ebonics framework, time's not linear and they still have relevance. Standing Bear wrote a book in 1928 that talked about settler colonialism and schools. And then, sort of how we teach and assimilate indigenous peoples in that whole process. So that colonial project is something that we really have to think about and consider if we're going to talk about any notion around, what conversations we need to have around CRT. The next one, this one, I really wrestled with a lot. What may be occurring because of, again, a new iteration of the new iteration of the Southern strategy. If you listen to Lee Atwater, well, so I'll just say what he said, but you can look at, but he says, you know, we can no longer call Black people the N-word. So instead of using the N-word openly, what we got to do is we got to face things like forced busing, states' rights. That becomes a substitute for the N-word. So, so instead of saying the N-word outright because of the Civil Rights Act, and it's not going to be tolerable, in our society now to say that openly like we used to be able to do. So now let's just use those kind of terms. Let's use war on drugs instead. That's the Southern strategy. What I'm saying about this anti-CRT business, I think there's a connection to anti-Black capitalism. And so, like, I'll give you a couple of resources to just consider. In the book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. 9th chapter. Chapter is called The Space Traders. He actually uses allegory to tell a story about what if all of our problems in terms of climate, because climate change is in here too, right? Climate change, healthcare, the gaps in terms of our resources, the shortages. So to restore all of our health and our wealth, and talking about the United States, and to restore the climate back to order. So the allegory was that there's these aliens, space, they came from, they came into the atmosphere, and they said, well, we have technology that will cure all of that. We just want one thing: give us all your Black people. They don't get to know what we're going to do with them. We just want all your Black people. And you can surmise what happened in the story. When the leaders at that time, the president in this allegorical tale, had to make the decision, you can imagine what decision they made. They give up all our Black people and everything will be good. Anti-Black capitalism, something that we need to consider. So that's Derek Bell. Another source I would encourage you to read is Edward Baptist, historian. He wrote a book called Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. How our wealth, basically, we became a world superpower based on the backs of enslaved Black folk, as well as the displacement of indigenous folk. And so those are very good sources to think about understanding the concept of anti-Black capitalism. Let me give you one example of the settler thing. So I'll read it too. So this is actually the early state seal of Wisconsin. And of course it's in, some of it's in Latin. Civilitas successit barbarum. Civilization succeeds barbarism. In the seal, there is an indigenous person, what looks to appear to be one, has a bow but no arrow. Notice that. Has a bow but no arrow. And the structures are going up all around the land. This person is facing away because they're on the way out. And the settlers are on the way in, establishing ground. These themes are viewed in ways that don't allow us to go back and look at this and examine history in a way that allows us to see the foundational pieces that we can actually do much going forward unless we do this. So the anti-CRT notion is really one that has to be critiqued in this prism of like the foundations of our society. And so that brings me to these coded sort of rhetoric and tactics is what I call them. In many ways, coded rhetoric and tactics. The first one is that, just like the Southern strategy, anti-CRT serves as a proxy. It's a stand-in. So in other words, it's not about critical race theory. Most of the folk in some of the news and the reporting that I've seen, if you ask them to do an in-depth analysis and description, they can't even tell you what it is. can't tell you what it is. And so what this is then in some ways, it's a proxy. But not only anti-Blackness, all kinds of other stuff that intersects. That's Kimberly Crenshaw's work. So going further then, the reason I say this is implicit association research. In implicit association research, the word Black has become a synonymous, or the word race, I'm sorry, the word race has become synonymous with Black people. And actually there's two other implicit associations I found. The other one was male, and then the third one, linking them together, was a negative view of that association. So Black males and negative. That's what the implicit association research suggests about this relationship with the word race and Black folk, and particularly Black men. And so, in fact, sometimes I think that there's been some social engineering. If you look at a film called Birth of the Nation, 1915, oh, somebody wants to chime in early in the discussion on the Zoom. So, that film basically is a depiction of, there's no Black actors, but they use white men in blackface, depicting this evil Black man who's after they get liberated by Civil War, they become raping, pillaging, marauding maniacs, and they're after white women. And so the only way to redeem them is for the people who are the saints who were dressed in white robes and hoods to redeem the civilization. And so they pursue this Black man and they lynch him. And that movie was celebrated. It was shown at the White House. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, said everybody needs to watch this film. One of the greatest achievements in cinema history at the time, in the early cinema history. So this relationship of being synonymous, not a new thing. I learned this word. So I have a brother. My brother is a veteran. He's a former special forces, retired special forces. Just happened to have a conversation about some of this national discussion. I said, man, this is just such a odd thing to see all these people at these meetings and they're screaming. And he says, yeah, they're barrage jamming. I said, what is that? So it's a tactic in the military that's used when people are trying to communicate and coordinate their organized movements. And in this case, was just substitute in the military campaign. Let's substitute anybody organizing for justice and freedom and rights and all of that. So barrage jamming means that the attempt is to just jam the airwaves with and disrupt their frequency so they can't communicate, can't coordinate. They get back into watching this, distracted by this and trying to solve this, that then they don't end up being able to coordinate their efforts. So in this case, the distraction and the noise jamming almost serves as white noise, if you will, that's so blaring that we can't do the organizing that's necessary for equity in some ways, because we're having to constantly fend off and figure out how to stop that barrage jamming from happening. And I say it this way, it's a barrage jamming campaign in some ways. So it's not about critical race, it's about 2022 and 2024. Because that's what it's always about. It's a power play. And it's using every technique that has been done before in new iterations so that it can keep perpetuating something that I think is really, really important to understand in all of this. And that is that there's a particular way and order that this country was founded on. And we're going to talk about that next with unpacking these. The same, the pushback, all of the comments and claims made. Now I'm going to take them and give you what I think is going on. So this word projection is up there first because there's a tactic that has always been deployed in these kinds of dynamics and social sciences, if you will. And that is that in order for political power to be maintained, what's often used is a technique called projection. In other words, one group will be engaging in certain kind of behaviors and then just claim that the other group is doing it. So in other words, if somebody says this is too divisive, well, to me, this is forgetting that this has already happened. You know, one of the first ways it happened legally, the Citizen Act of 1790. So the Citizen Act of 1790, they decided, right? The Constitution was not even dry yet. And what's the first act they passed? Oh, let's decide who gets to be an American citizen. You think Black people get to be American citizens? Nope, they didn't. Is that divisive? Oh, let's talk about Jim Crow. Is that divisive? Oh, separate water fountains. Is that divisive? So it's projection. This has already happened, but not to white people, not in the way that they are claiming. It's happened to basically separate out all the other people. It's indoctrinating people in the Marxist worldview. So this one's tricky, because again, it's almost assuming that there was this notion of opportunity from the beginning, and equal opportunity. So if critical race theory says that all we're trying to do is make sure that we have a better way to examine how race plays into our outcomes, and if there are any structural barriers, we need to get rid of those. But then somebody comes with, well, that's a Marxist worldview. But in fact, there's already forms of what people would define as socialism that happen for people every day, particularly for wealthy white men. The tax bill, the bailouts of the banks. Is that socialism? Projection. It teaches Black children they are inferior. This one floors me because I'm like, so having literal body trauma from years and years of internalized racist categories, like from slavery all the way through Jim Crow, all the way through discrimination, as if that already is not infecting a self-view for many, many children of color, particularly, right? And it dismisses all kinds of, again, studies that have demonstrated the damage of psychological damage of racism. For instance, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who did the Dow test, preceding Brown versus Board, demonstrated that Black children were already feeling inferior because of racism, not because of a divisive tactic like or theory like CRT. And again, similarly related, it makes white children feel blamed for the past. Again, to say nothing about all the other children, what they must feel like every single day to go out into a society, not for the past, for present discrimination, for present marginalization, for present exclusion, not for the past. This is what they feel today. Study after study after study will tell us what children are feeling right now today. You don't have to go to the past. And then lastly, it's un-American or against American values. This one, guess what? I agree with them. I agree. This is not, it's against American values, actually. CRT actually is against American values. You know why? Because in American values, there's an assumption that there is a we, and that there has always been a we. The Constitution says we the people, right? Hold these truths. Self-evident that all what? Are created equal. And yet they practiced a system that said, somebody looks like me, my sister right here, brother over there, oh, y'all 3/5 of a person. Who is we? So I say on this one, they're actually right. It's against American values. If that's how we're going to find American values. So what are our ways forward in all of this? A couple of articles that I want to share with you. Just again, I'll just name them because I think they're important as we go forward. There's one called The Skin Color Paradox and the American Racial Order. It's by Hochschild and Weaver. And it talks about, again, the skin color paradigm there's some aspects around how what Du Bois had framed even 100 years before this, or hundreds, more than 100 years before this article was written, when he said the greatest problem at that time of the 20th century would be that of the color line. So it talks about the outcomes being measured and being understood through that lens of skin color and skin tone, even among same quote unquote racial groups. So in other words, dark skinned Black folk actually in data, we can actually verify this. If you look at it, have worse outcomes than light skinned Black folk. And that's actually true of almost every other quote unquote racial category. Skin color plays an important factor in all of that. And so this article calls that out. So again, it's called The Skin Color Paradox and the American Racial Order by Hochschild and Weaver. I didn't want to put it on my PowerPoint, but anybody that wants this, I can share that with you going forward. So I think that part of this whole thing in these coded tactics and rhetoric is that there's a need and a kind of a pulling against what's our social order going to look like. That's what this is all about. What is the social order going to be? Who's going to be the power dominant group in society? That's the wrestling. That's the reckoning part. That's the racial reckoning. What's that going to look like? What is really instructive about this as we go forward? One thing I might want to tell you is this. This is actually something that I was researching in a book by Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness. What Metzl is talking about in Dying of Whiteness is white folks are actually harmed in a way by racist policies. In other words, policies that are designed to keep Black and brown and indigenous and all the other people out. Poor whites particularly are harmed by those same policies. They would rather die than actually allow access and opportunity for somebody, maybe even in their same class structure, but who's Black. That's a heavy, complex thing to really get inside of and unpack. That's what's going on. And so they're harmed. But so for me, I think about Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder said, when you believe in things you don't understand, you suffer. Superstition ain't the way. He talks about it in that song. You believe in things you don't understand, you suffer. So we have to understand that this is always on the table and it's always at play. It's what do we do with it? So here's what I think. Something I particularly am interested in. So I call it Black joy. Now, again, what does that mean? It means if you're white and if you identify as white, what does that mean for me? Black joy. I think it's instructive, just like Ebonics is instructive. Just because Ebonics, is framed and formed out of people who have that particular cultural identity doesn't mean that white folk can't be informed by what it teaches us, right? About time and about other things. Black joy to me is a center of the fact of that throughout all this history I've been sharing, there has always been Black joy as sort of leading the effort, right? Even amongst all people to actually do something about our inequities. Without that Black joy, I don't know that we could have actually had a civil rights movement. People willing to take on and endure that kind of violence and yield, still show up singing. I saw a clip in the last election where people were waiting 12 hours in line to vote, and they were dancing and singing. You ain't gonna keep me from voting. It seems like that doesn't seem like it, but there's something instructive about that, because it's about somatic experiences. When I say somatic, it's of the body. People get internalized trauma, and so our nervous system get impacted. And so one of the things to work against that is exercise and other ways of expressing that allows one's nervous system to calm, even when one's experiencing discrimination. And then it's instructive also to another element in this, white allies and solidarity. Let me just quickly give you a sample, though. I want to give you a sample of Black joy before we go on to white solidarity. Because again, I use music and art a lot because I think it's really powerful reminders of and evidence of how culturally these things can take place. Just find it. Here it is. James Brown. So, first the song in 1969, 68, 69, at a time when there's a lot of uprisings, a lot of upheaval, and yet he had a song that made people want to dance, and he's saying something instructive in the lyrics, say it loud. Like, that's Black joy. That's what that is, right? So, in creative resistance movements, it's important then to have white solidarity and allies. So I think about this. Anybody that's interested in really diving deep into this, I suggest you read the biography of John Brown. And again, Du Bois was such a prolific scholar. I know I'm quoting him a lot, but he wrote a biography of John Brown that is powerful. Anybody that's talking about, oh, what should I do if I want to be an ally? I want to be a white ally. Read Du Bois's biography of John Brown. One of the greatest white allies this country's ever produced. Another one in terms of politics, in my view, is Thaddeus Stevens. Read about Thaddeus Stevens, who was actually in Lincoln's court, which is interesting. So what this means though is like, how do we build the kind of solidarity with people enough to grapple with, not that we have to have the same way and the same belief systems and all that, but like, how do we build it enough so that we can be human in the world together? Because part of this project about anti-Blackness, by the way, there's an element of it that basically is pushing against that Black folks were not considered to be humans, and still aren't in so many ways, but especially in terms of our history. And so, and other folk, right? Indigenous folk. There's a book called Exterminate All the Brutes that talks about that. And then finally, I say it this way: recognize the global majority. In other words, I don't use the word minority when it refers to like Black people, indigenous people. I don't use minority. Because again, this is where colonization has sometimes inhabited our space, where we assume things, right, about demographics and so forth that aren't necessarily totally true if you think about it in a broader context. So in other words, 3/4 of the world's population are not white. And yet white folks control the economic base of most of the globe. So what I always instruct is, if we're going to be in solidarity, we have to understand that. You have to understand what that means personally and then collectively, and what to do with it. I'm not giving you the answers right now. I'm just saying we have to think about what that means. Understand what to do with it personally and then collectively. I think there's something instructive in understanding and reframing our orientation toward how we see each other in terms of numbers, minoritized versus, right? So I think of it as a global majority when we're talking about all the groups who we would think of as minorities. All right. I think about there's a book that was written by Keisha Blaine, and I'm paraphrasing, but she quotes Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'll close with this, and then we open up for questions. Fannie Lou Hamer said, "I America to know that whether you're Black or white, none of us is free until I am free." And that's what this is all about. this whole uproar about how do we see what so-called CRT, frame it, how do we, what do we want people to be quote unquote taught and not taught, and then we put it together with all of the kind of understanding historically that we have around positions and maneuvering for power, economically being at the top of that, moving to maneuver for power, and then all of our freedom, going back to Jonathan Metzl. So if Black and brown children, like in Flint, Michigan, by the way, they still have poison water, but then so do the poor white people. So if they ain't free, ain't nobody free. Thank you. What's questions? What questions do we have? We can put the mic, because I know we're on Zoom. And if they're on Zoom, they have questions, just read it out loud for us, please.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. My question is, in all of the hoopla or tripping over CRT, that's happening in lots of different spaces, in particular, as you know, in our school systems and board meetings. So how do we, or what is your suggestion for like not getting caught in the trap, I guess? Because I guess in part what I'm sort of hearing you saying is the if it's this projection, but that they're trying to get people sucked into this conversation, that it's of let's debate something, or let's get sucked into the minutia of this CRT thing, when that's not really, and first of all, that's not what's being taught in schools anyway. So I don't know if this makes sense to you, but like, how do we not get sucked into this trap of having this conversation that really isn't what this is really about, and deflecting off of all of the bigger, larger issues of what's going on in our communities and for our kids and families, and really what the larger question should be. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. So, because that's what I mean. That's the barrage jamming. How do we not get sucked into that? Because getting so, inundated with that jamming that we feel like we have to respond. That's what that is, right? So my brother also gave me another instructive technique that they use to counter that. Change the frequency that you're communicating by. Right? So these are strategies, these are tactics. Change the frequency. So what that would mean in this case is, this is why I asked the question. Like, I've been invited to these same debates. Like, could you explain what it is? And so, because we're, we want to have an argument around why it's not supposed to be taught, right? And that's why I said right away, I'm not interested in telling you what it is or what it isn't. I'm asking you, why are you tripping? And I'm asking you in this way, why are you so concerned about these things? What is it? So I use mindful inquiry, in other words. What are you so concerned about? What are you so concerned about? And then sometimes people will reveal their real world view because I want white power. I mean, so sometimes they might say that, or sometimes they might actually reveal some of the implicit associations, and then you can say, well, all right. And another thing I would suggest is this. When I respond to this sort of this discussion, there's nothing wrong with just bringing the facts and saying, well, there's no evidence of what you're claiming. And now they're not going to accept. They're not always going to accept that, right? And by the way, while I'm at it, what tends to happen is violence is always on the table, unfortunately. So I said I was going to come back to this, and I didn't do it there, but this is the perfect place. So in that House bill, when it said, people promoting the overthrow of the United States government, I was like, did they just watch what happened January 6th, or is that in there? Was that the reason why they also put that in that bill, or was the CRT's thought that then people rushed the Capitol and took it down? So, my point is that in these discussions, it's just important to bring some of a lens and a strategy to say, I'm not going to argue if that's what you want to do, to argue about the basic, credibility and efficacy of the theory itself. It's, well, why are you asking it that way? What do you assume? What's your fear all about? That make sense? Awesome. Oh.
Since you're kind of on the topic, so I actually used to be vice president of a school board. And I used to be in education. My last year of being vice president, I was actually at like a workshop where we're CRT and everything, and there was a very interesting perspective I actually heard regarding, the people who go to school board meetings all angry about CRT, despite not knowing what CRT is about. Somebody at this workshop was saying that we need to stop treating these people like they're the top of the problem and start maybe understanding that maybe they're more like a victim of, like the right wing propaganda that you were pointing out. What are your, and it kind of made sense to me. It's like some of these people, they just lack some of that critical thinking. There a lot of times it's, they lack the socioeconomic, structure behind them when they were learning in education, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts on that? Like theory that these people who are angry at CRT are the victims of essentially hateful propaganda.
So, and again, because of how information is delivered through all of these online, sources that are not basically what we do in the academy here, which is to empirically verify evidence and use scholarly-based processes and things that are more scientific in terms of the study, whether it's a social science or a biological science and otherwise. So that's a real phenomenon. Like people are getting information and they're getting hyped up. But I don't know that it's totally, I don't know that I would totally say that it's not them, because it is some. I mean, I would just say that in my estimation, it's important though to look at that. Yes, there's a tactic that always has been employed with a certain class of folk, particularly, again, I'm saying this in terms of white, heterosexual, I'm putting all the things, white, sexual, Christian, men, cisgender, who are, tall. I'm actually saying that not even facetiously. Like height is actually a part of that too. That's top of the power structure. And there's so in other words, there's all kinds of techniques that group has been doing for years to get people to buy into this. But race is the weapon, though, or the fear. And so here's my answer to that. This is another question. I'm sorry, over here. That first question. I don't know your name, Kent. Yes, the first question. This actually relates to your question too. There's a new book by Heather McGee called The Sum of Us. She talks about having discussion around why is this a zero-sum thing for some people? Meaning, okay, so some black and brown folk might have a little bit more access, even a little bit more, and you take that as, oh, that means I'm going to lose everything. Because that's what's going on too. I think you have to have a mic for the people on.
It's interesting to say that because, like, I even had a little bit of a perspective change after hearing about that, where I tried to change how I engaged with these, parents who were, you're trying to teach my child that they should be ashamed to be white and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Where instead of, me coming at them from a stance of you're angry, I came at them from a stance of you've been misinformed by somebody and now I want to help you. And it seemed to change the conversation.
Yeah. That's another point again to both of your this is helping me remember even more to share with you. So some of you who know me, I have a practice. I'm trying to catch up. I mean, I'm always humbled to be able to be invited to share my perspectives, but I don't consider myself an expert in anything because I feel like I was talk about indoctrination. I was reared in this educational system, and my schooling didn't. I'm just speaking my truth. It didn't really help me. I had to do a lot of things, but I used to go to public library because we didn't get these lessons in school, and my family gave us something. So I learned a lot of things late. So my personal practice right now is I'm probably reading about 5 or 6 books at one time, so I can catch up. I'm trying to catch up, reading articles, doing research, and so I think it's instructive because I was just remembering. There's a book, and actually a video. It's on YouTube too, but there's a book and also there's a YouTube clip of this happening. Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was one of the founders of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panthers. Fred Hampton would be in a meeting. This to your point about white folk who don't feel like you're trying to overturn the race. Fred Hampton would intentionally shout to everybody in the room. He would say things like, "White power to white people, black power to black people." He would say it. He was organizing ways of doing what I'm talking about, the solidarity across racial, ethnic, class, geographical boundaries. He had hillbillies. I mean, I hope that's not a derogatory, but he had people in, you know, Appalachia coming to his meeting saying, "We're with you." And then they killed him. 22 years old. But his point, he would say white. So in other words, just because you're trying to be in solidarity, don't mean you don't have to have understand and be proud of being white or be white or right. You ain't gonna lose nothing. He was trying to get us to see a different way of thinking about how that whole dynamic works. So that's another instructive thing to maybe take those people. You know, this is not new. Fred Hampton said it a propaganda about Fred Hampton. Actually go and read Fred Hampton or watch what he was doing. Anybody on Zoom or anything? I don't know if
I have a question.
Oh, somebody chimed in.
Sure. So I'm a historian and I've studied in many different museums and stuff. In your great curriculum, where do you reference the thousands of Black slave owners during the South and their influence on your teaching? And what is the exact difference between CRT and Marxist Hitler propaganda in the 1930s?
First of all, you use the word great. There's nothing I said that was great about any curriculum. So I can see your point, whoever you are, sir, to try to do that noise jamming, but I guess what? I'm not the one. So let me just tell you, one of the things is this. There's no great curriculum. I didn't mention that. And what you stated, I would have you go and do more of your own research because you conflated Marxism with CRT, and it's not, you already said that. So I'm not going to go over something I already said. Thank you.
We have another question from the chat that says, is there anything you might suggest people do to leverage one of the CRT tenets, interest convergence, to make economic, educational, and political progress for people of color?
Thank you. So that question is actually an important one to understand in the context of something that is actually being discussed in critical race studies circles. Is CRT a good, is interest convergence a good thing? So to many of you, if you want to know more about that, I'll briefly say what that one is. So it's basically, my way of saying it is this. Any, and according to some of the other scholars who write about interest convergence, any advancement for folk and brown folk and indigenous folks, et cetera, that are made only happen if and only if those same policies and or strategies and or procedures benefit white people. So in other words, white folks institutionally will not act on behalf of anybody else unless it also benefits them. That's just convergence. Now, what it does in a system that's already not equal is it does this. So I don't call them gaps, by the way, in opportunity or gaps in achievement. I call them racialized, predictable outcomes. But if they're like because interest convergence means if I can get something, they get something, we're doing equal, as opposed to I don't need to have something benefit me if it benefits people. So that's the question. Now, there are some people, and me being one of them, I don't know if that is not all necessarily a bad thing to have a little bit of interest convergence, if it'll get some people to the table. And I'm saying to the table because that's an entry point. I'm not one of those that has this one or nothing. I'm not a zero-sum person. So I think about it like this. Yeah, okay, if they need some interest convergence to get us talking, that's better than not talking. And then if I'm talking, because maybe I have some powers of persuasion, I can say, you know, I know you're doing this for this, but you know, maybe you don't need to only do it because it's going to benefit you, because here's why you still will be fine, and even if it doesn't totally benefit you the same way that it benefits somebody else. Like that's the entry point. That's how I would answer that question about the interest convergence question. Yes.
I was really struck by what you said when you were talking about race being synonymous with Black. And I wonder about the implications of that for this sort of problematic Black-white binary. And if you could unpack that for me a little bit and the broader implications of it. Thanks.
Yeah, so so on the color line, I'll go to that first. It's really instructive because how I've basically developed my thinking on this is based on several ways of knowing. So in Africana studies, I've been studying a lot of what they call ways of knowing. And one of the ways of knowing in this context is understanding identity, right? And the axis points, or no, actually, I'll put it this way, the pole points of identity. Now, I'm gonna say something that might be controversial to some of y'all, but that's why I'm here. Sometimes we have to think. And so it's synonymous with Black people, and then by adjacency, it becomes synonymous with anybody who's not white. So what I mean by that is I know we push against binaries all the time. People, hey, I'm non-binary, even whether it's race or gender, I get it. We're pushing against binary. Here's the thing though, in the construction of this nation, it's a binary. And here's what I'm gonna say that's controversial. If you ain't white, you might as well be Black. Because at some point you're gonna run up against the standard. That's what I mean by poles. The poles are white and Black. And any adjacency you might have to one side or the other renders you to be able to navigate a little bit more successfully on the one hand or not on the other hand. So whether we push against it or like it or not, there is a binary at play in terms of how these people are constructed in terms of that group at the top is what I'm saying. That's the complex nature of this. Yeah, I want to push against it too, but it's a reality that we have to grapple with the nuances. And the nuances is that, you know, because in my culture, we had folk in history that tried to pass for white. There was a thing called the brown paper bag test in high society, quote unquote, Black communities, where if you were lighter than the brown paper bag, you could get in. You still was Black because you couldn't get into the white clubs. That's what I mean by if you ain't white, you might as well be Black, because at some point you have to navigate against whiteness. Yeah. Yes. Oh, you want to ask another question? So she feel say y'all ain't asking no question.
Well, you just sparked, when you, what you just said, is that, do you think that that's Wilkerson's in her book Cast? Is that essentially what her thesis sort of is, what you kind of just said in terms of how she sort of frames this, as that in terms of that caste language, or just if you're not 100% white, you're not white, and the opposite of that, and then everything else there.
So yeah, there's two things. Yeah, I think Wilkerson, she does sort of allow us to see that and gives us an entry point into understanding both Blackness and whiteness, right, from a skin color perspective. But she talks about dark skin and that a lot, and in fact, she across different cultures in the caste system in India and here and in Nazi Germany. And so I think that she does sort of help to see some insights into this phenomena. But I think what's also maybe a good way to think and resource is that in our own history, just remember, see, this is about historical memory. In our own history, Irish people were not always white. Italian people were not always white. The Dutch were, I mean, there was an agreement, going back to, again, there was a solidification of an agreement. You know what? If you're Irish, we know we were beating y'all. We know we were putting y'all to the field and making y'all suffer under indentured servitude. We know we were doing that, but guess what? If you want a little piece of this pie, just become white, and then we'll give you the whip. You can be the overseer. We'll give you a little bit of land, not as much as we have, by the way, but we'll give you a little bit of land, give you a whip, right? So that's why I'm saying this whole thing about white and Black, it moves over time based on the political expediency of the group at the top. And so that's really important to understand. That's when I say binary, yeah, I mean, essentially it goes back to that, whether we're pushing against it, but it goes back to it. In fact, let me give you this point. In the last census, something that was revealed is very, very important. And I think this is another reason that's driving people to do what you're seeing. I'm going to include, by the way, I'm including anti-maskers. I get it. I know, but I'm including that too, because it's the same kind of rhetoric. But here's the thing. So when I think about this white, black, paradigm, the shift or the binary. I think what the fear that's being generated is this part of the census report. So the first time in a long time, so there's this box for Hispanic groups. Are you white Hispanic or they want to check. What they're doing again, and I'm critical of census reports, by the way. I'm critical, why are they asking the question that way? But so they've been asking for years, white Hispanic. What they trying to do? They're trying to get Hispanic people to become white. They're trying to get people, and certain Asian groups, they're trying to get them to become white. Because they don't have enough, quote unquote, numbers that they think that they're going to need to continue this project. And I'm saying they, meaning again, I'm talking about a very specific group. So just be clear about that, right? And so that's also at play with this, with all of the rhetoric that we're seeing. Is that census report says for the first time, a lot of folk didn't choose the white Hispanic box. They said, no, what? No, I'm going to choose. Because, none of them were saying, you know what? I may look white and I may actually be white to people, but my brother is dark or my uncle is black, especially the Afro-Cuban population. We always think of Latino. We don't think of the black Cuban, right, as being Latino. So, but a lot of their kinfolk are saying, no, I'm gonna be with you now, because they're starting to see that, you know what, no matter what I do, I can't get into that ultimate club unless I choose to completely erase my whole thing, including my family, by the way. What other questions or discussion points?
There was some question earlier in the chat that I think you really addressed when you talked about ways to ask more questions to help figure out why someone might have challenges with CRT. But how, in the meantime, as administrators or as faculty in these K-12 schools where kids end up being the victim of this, another like vast showing of racism, how do we show them support? How do we show them love? And how do we take care of the kids through all of this that's happening at these school board meetings, but they're hearing and being swept in with?
Yeah. So you said a word that I think matters, love. That's why I told y'all at the beginning, even my brother who came on and tried to barrage jam me, I still love. I don't know if he's still there, but I still love, but I ain't gonna let you just come up in here and spout some stuff that's not your intention is not to actually have an honest discussion. It's about barrage jamming. That's like, and again, this is a thing that's a technique. I'll diverge and I'll come back to it. Just so you know. The reason why I did that, I'm not interested with arguing with a person who believes the moon is made out of cheese. That doesn't help us. If there's a legitimate way to have it, and he can even disagree. In fact, I didn't say this, I have a lot of disagreement with some of the tenets of CRT. You can have discussion, but don't come try to barrage jam. That's got to be a different reason for that. So, but now to your point, love. You said it. That's the most important element to me personally, because what it does is it starts with myself. I got to give myself enough grace to understand how to empathize with other people because of my own internalized stuff. Everybody in this room, for the most part, has different forms of internalized traumas, triggers, things that cause us some unsettled nervous systems in some way. That's a human condition. I'm not just generalizing, I'm saying stuff that's found in the evidence. But what do I do with that is the important thing, so that I can help somebody else, and that's love. So love can be also described in ways that I think matters to about justice and about if you're an educator, if you're thinking about the well-being of the community. Cornel West comes up to my mind because the critical scholar Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So what we do is love enough to go into some discomfort in some ways to be able to do something. We have to bring back, not suspend, but bring back cognitive dissonance. And I'm saying that way. What I mean by that is any human being, if we are in our natural state, there's a lot of scholarship on this. If you see another human being suffering, I don't care what color they are, a natural inclination of human beings would be to protect other human beings. but we've suspended, or in some ways it's been engineered for us to suspend our cognitive dissonance so that we can see a Black man getting suffocated for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and do nothing. We can see a Black man in Georgia get hunted down from a pickup truck and do nothing because we suspend cognitive dissonance as opposed to re-engage it. That's love. So if I'm an educational leader, if I'm even here. So how much you know? So my role here, I do what I do because I love people. And I love them enough to embrace that discomfort enough to, or experience it enough to go forward and have some courageous conversations if we need to have some disagreements, and also to come into alignment with every decision that we make in terms of leadership. What I've been asking is this, how, and I'm using ebonics again, how do it free us? How do it free us? That's love. And so whether it's taking a stance and saying, you know what, we're going to protect our kids, we're not going to let you, or we're going to stand up. You know, again, speaking of the theory, I've done it here. It's like, I'm not trying to indoctrinate anybody. What I'm trying to do is give us a way of thinking. Critical race theory is a framework. It's not the only framework. It's a framework. And in academic settings, the job is to teach people to think critically for themselves. I don't care who chooses to use the framework in here, actually. It don't matter to me. Use it or not. I don't even always use it. Because if it doesn't help me answer the question I'm trying to ask, then I don't use it. If it helps me something, I'll use it. It's a framework, right? So that's the other thing. I stand up for academic freedom. I stand up for teaching children to think critically. And I push back against the notion of people assuming that I'm trying to convert the kids into some worldview, which it's impossible for me to do. So that's kind of how I would answer that question. So stand up and say, you know what, we're going to teach about history in ways that understands race, right? Luckily, we live in a state where they didn't ban it yet. I'm saying yet, because I don't assume anything when it comes to this, right? But here we can say, you know what, we can stand up. Nah. But now, I mean, I might as well say, if you're in this room and you don't want it to get banned, maybe you do. But if you don't, you can't sit on the sidelines. Can't be neutral if we want justice, because it's not a one-person show. It's a collective project. It's a collective process. We got to show up and voices be heard against, you know, certain things. Because again, what I also didn't mention here, we're close. We're on the brink. You know, that January 6th thing is just a precursor, potentially. You know, people in fascist Italy and in Germany thought, oh, we're going to be fine. And then all of a sudden, Hitler took power. Mussolini took power. A lot of people didn't think that was going to happen, but they're sitting on the sideline. Oh, you know, he's just making these speeches, and he. So can't be neutral. You got to keep up. But Black joy, I'll go back to that. Black folks have never been neutral. They've been like, no, what? Now we're trying to tell y'all something. When I say Black joy, what I mean by that is listen to Black people, because they can tell you some stuff that you might be able to learn from when I say that. Like, they've been telling us for years, you know, that's like, I remember when Trayvon Martin, right? If anybody's old enough to remember, because I know that may be years ago now for some of y'all who are just now starting college, but, you know, I think, was that 2009 already, Trayvon Martin? So just look it up if you're younger, because another Black man shot and killed. But one of the things I remember about that trial is everybody I knew in my white circles were like, oh, you know, this can't possibly, they're going to, like, you're going to get convicted. George Floyd was a shock to me, because that's actually not actually normally the case. Most people I know in my community, no, that ain't gonna happen. I'm worried about that Arbery case, because they got stand your ground in Georgia. It's not a conclusion that they're gonna get convicted for hunting a Black man down and shooting him to death. So, but what does though make sense is Black joy, because we've been saying stuff. So listen to Black folk. So, yep. Oh, you got a question? Yeah, please. I like it. I like people to just make sure that.
So my question, so I know recently, about a month ago, Turning Point came to our school, and they did that thing on exposing critical race theory. And to my understanding, they didn't actually expose anything about critical race theory. But it was really disheartening and alarming to see that kind of not only like accepted but embraced by a community within our school. And I guess my question is, what steps can we as white allies take to kind of nip that in the bud, and kind of, because the misinformation, blatant misinformation being passed off as freedom of speech is a big problem in Minnesota, at our school, everywhere. So I just kind of, what steps have you seen or do you think would be beneficial to kind of snuff out that misinformation, protect it under the guise of?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. Thank you for that. And so here's my response. Because I think, again, I uphold, I keep the brother, I keep saying, yeah, every right, free speech. He has the question, you can join, right? And I'm not, but I also have the freedom to say, you tripping. I have that same freedom though. So if I say you tripping, don't get mad at me, right? And so, but in that situation, right, there is free speech. And I'm aware of that happened here. And so, my stance was, there are students that have a particular connection to some of that. That's their right. They have the right to do that. The engagement, though, comes into what I've just said earlier about asking the questions. So the kind of questions that lead to this discourse around, okay, so, if that's the worldview, because we're supposed to be in an institution of higher learning, we're supposed to rely on, research and evidence. It's a way to engage, like really going into that particular realm. Now, again, and you have every right, though, this is important, right? Because there's only so much with a person who believes the moon is made out of cheese. So there's only so much, but so that's up to you too. It's up to you to decide how much to engage or not. I think, and so there's a protocol that I follow that about courageous conversations. It's an actual way to talk about race. But in one of those agreements that I've adopted is, at certain times, I just have to accept and expect non-closure on something. Right. And then the other thing I would say to you is this. You build with the people that you can build with. And there's some people that you'll be able to maybe engage in those difficult conversations with, that at least will be, like sort of a mutual respectful kind of a thing. And then some people, probably not. Right. But it shouldn't. But here's what I'm thinking. Going back to the barrage jamming technique. What I'm saying is this. Don't let that, though, stop you from all the other building. Because that's what happens. You get so caught up over here trying to convince these people who really in some ways don't want to be convinced, as opposed to building solidarity with the people who are ready with us, particularly when it comes across racial boundaries. I'm saying that intentionally in a room, in an institution that's predominantly white. I'm saying we really have to be careful with that when it comes to the fact that you can be building with multiracial coalitions as opposed to trying to convince. And by the way, let me just say it this way, because this is true. The groups who are doing this and wanting to have that kind of discussion, as opposed to a real complex dialogue that can be debated, a real debate, in other words, they're actually a fraction of the society. But yet they have so much attention, they're sucking so much attention. But that's been engineered too, right? So let me give you one quick example. California has approximately 39 point something million people as a state. They have 2 senators. Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, I can go on. I can name about 10 or maybe even 17 other states that don't have the population just of California alone, and yet they all have 2 senators. So the voices of 39.2 million people are getting drowned out by people who are way less people than them because of our system. So it doesn't mean you can't understand that and still build that global majority. Go and join with that, so that piece doesn't neglect you or stop you from building, if that's what you're truly desiring. Does that make sense? Or yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to add, I think it's along the lines of what you're saying. I'm a faculty here, but I'm an advisor to a student group on campus. There are a lot of student groups on campus that they're with a lot of opportunities to do cross solidarity work. So for all of you who are students, the opportunity for that to happen here is because there's a student group on campus that's Turning Point, and so they can bring in a guest speaker, and it can be publicized and sponsored at this institution, and that's their right. But I would say to all of you is that instead of spending time trying to make that not happen or to try to wrapped up in that, and I think this is to your point, is that create alternative opportunities for your peers to be able to come together and to talk about these issues and have, right? And so that's not the only thing that's happening. And I think to your point was it turns it into like, maybe there's, you know, that this is a large percentage of people who think about this or agree with this. So, you know, use those organizations and collaborate on some of these opportunities to do the kinds of things that you want to do, bringing people in, having these conversations, and do it in a cross way to create this alternative. And that starts to give people who maybe don't even think about some of these things a lot more opportunity to do that. And so, and I know the group I'm involved with, which is not relevant necessarily to this per se, but I know that that's what I keep saying them. You got to do cross solidarity stuff and reach out to other groups.
We'll take one more in the back. I think it might be getting time, but I know I'll say a little bit longer just if anybody wants to engage, but yeah, this last question back here.
Fantastic. My question is, to what extent can CRT be a vehicle of protection for non-white people?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
To what extent can CRT be a vehicle of protection for non-white people?
Because white is a color too. Remember, that's why I said that implicit association. This ain't just for black folk and brown folk. White is a color too. So in what way can it be a protection? It's a way of knowing. That's how it can be. There's a whole part of the theory called critical whiteness studies that white folks can understand their role as a color, right? As a constructed color to be able to advance their intention, right? And their understanding, their learning, and their connectivity to the other groups, right? So that's the way I'm thinking is that, so I would encourage to look up, you know, that particular element of CRT. There's a whole branch of that, so that you can maybe, you know, lean in. And there's some other like sociologists and scholars that also I would encourage, like Robin DiAngelo. I would encourage you to read her work. Of course, one of the most fierce of all time, she's like in her mid 80s and still just rocking, is Jane Elliott. If you don't know who Jane Elliott is, look up Jane Elliott because she be bringing it. I'm using ebonics again. She be bringing it. But so that's an entry point because they will help understand that no, it absolutely can be a mechanism and a vehicle for white folk to understand along with the other, you know, groups in terms of the scholarship around CRT. Thank you for that question. So I'll just stop and say this. Thank you to those on Zoom. Whenever I engage with people, even with people I'm seeing for the first time, because my presupposition is love, you know, so is my postlude. And so I just thank you for being here. And I end with this. I love y'all and there's nothing you can do about it. Have a good day.